Welcome to Your Mythology Book Club. I'm your host, Daniel. In each episode of this series, we'll do a close reading exploration of one book of the Iliad until we've covered all 24 of them. This is episode 4, and so we'll cover book 4. As always, I'll be reading the most critical parts of the Iliad, including all the dialogue, to you from the translation by Lang, Leaf, and Myers. It's available free online since its copyright has expired. I've linked to it in the show notes, where you'll also find links to some more modern translations should you like to do your own Iliad read-through. The Iliad comes to us from the depths of time. It was ancient to the ancients who collected it from among even older stories into the form we have. This means it's an artifact of literary culture that has been filtered through the minds of people from multiple time periods, each of which represent cultures far different from our own. Therefore, I'll go on tangents to explain some of the more confusing or intriguing historical, religious, and cultural aspects we'll come across. These tangents are what makes this more than just a simple audiobook podcast, and they will help you to get so much more out of the Iliad. I'm not a professional scholar, but I am a very well-read amateur, and this is how I first read the Iliad, pausing here and there to ask, why? Why are the characters doing these strange things? And then doing my own reading to answer these questions. Getting a handle on why the characters in the Iliad are doing some of the things they're doing will help us understand their motivations. Seeing their motivations in the light of their own culture will allow us to discover the very human story that forms the heart of the Iliad. Today in Book 4, we'll follow the action as the duel between Menelaus and Paris ended abruptly when the goddess Aphrodite whisked Paris away from the battlefield, leaving Menelaus the seeming victor by default. But will the Trojan army accept this loss caused by a god who supports their own side? The two armies are both upon the field still, awaiting the decisions of their leaders. The Greek leader Agamemnon has declared victory for his brother Menelaus, but we haven't heard from the Trojan leadership yet. Will the Trojan leader Hector agree and cede victory to the Greeks? Or will the truce declared for the duel be broken and battle commence immediately? In addition to following the action of Book 4, in this episode I'll provide you with in-depth looks at two of the most important characters affecting the outcome of Book 4, High King of the Greeks Agamemnon and the very pro-Greek goddess Athene. Since the action of Book 4 picks up exactly where Book 3 left off, there's only a little bit we need to recap. Remember that Book 3 consisted of a duel between Menelaus and Paris, and the leaders of both sides had agreed to abide by the results of the duel, and would award Helen and all her treasure to whichever of these two men won, her current or her former husband. They had sealed the deal with a formal sacrifice to the gods, and oaths binding each side to respect the result of the duel. The exact words of the oath were, "Zeus most glorious, most great, and all ye immortal gods, which folk soever be first to sin against the oaths, may their brains be so poured forth upon the earth, even as this wine, theirs and their children's, and let their wives be made subject unto strangers." That's pretty serious stuff. The duel began, and Menelaus was doing well in it. Doing well, but he hadn't finished off Paris before the younger man simply vanished. We, the audience, knew what happened to Paris, that he had been magically transported to his own bedroom inside the city of Troy by the goddess Aphrodite, who then went on to bully Helen into joining him there. But those on the battlefield had no idea how Paris had managed to disappear from a dueling ground that was surrounded by the two armies gathered to watch the fight. Agamemnon had declared victory for his brother Menelaus, a victory by default, we suppose, because whether Paris had fled or not, he'd abandoned the fight, leaving Menelaus the only combatant still within the designated dueling ground. And now here we are in the opening of Book 4, with Zeus admitting to the other gods that Menelaus is the victor, but he's floating the idea to Hera and Athene that maybe the gods could just look the other way and come up with some reason to let the Trojans off easy. I can guarantee you, however, that as the two most staunchly pro-Greek gods, Hera and Athene are not going to agree to let the Trojans off easy. Now the gods sat by Zeus and held assembly on the golden floor, and in the midst the lady Hebe poured them their nectar. They with golden goblets pledged one another, and gazed upon the city of the Trojans. Then did Cronos' son essay to provoke Hera with vexing words, and spake maliciously. "Twain goddesses hath Menelaus for his helpers, even Hera of Argos and Alcmenian Athene. Yet these sit apart and take their pleasure in beholding. But beside that other ever standeth laughter-loving Aphrodite, and wardeth off fate from him. And now hath she saved him, as he thought to perish. But of a truth the victory is to Menelaus dear to Ares. So let us take thought how these things shall be. Whether once more we shall arouse ill war and the dread battle din, or put friendship between the foes. Moreover, if this were welcome to all and well-pleasing, the city of King Priam may yet be an habitation, and Menelaus take back Helen of Argos. So Book 4 is opening with the gods upon Olympus, drinking nectar and toasting one another. It's just another day for them. Zeus asks the other gods present, and for all we know, there may be several other Olympian gods present, but the ones we know are present are obviously Zeus himself, Hebe, who is a servant goddess and married to Heracles, now that he's ascended as a god, and Hera and Athene. And Zeus is feeling a little rambunctious. He wants to stir the pot, and provoking Hera is one of his favorite pastimes. So Zeus asks these other gods how they should handle the fallout of this unresolved duel between Paris and Menelaus. Hera is irritated by Zeus pointing out how well Paris came off in the duel against Menelaus just now, despite only having the one unwarlike goddess Aphrodite as his ally, while Menelaus has two goddesses, Hera and Athene, to support him, yet neither of them was present on the battlefield for the duel. And Zeus says a few other things. For one, he confirms for the Greek audience that Menelaus technically won the duel. We can presume this is a victory by default, due to Paris having left the field. But another thing he says, which really irritates Hera, is when he floats the idea of causing friendship between the Greeks and Trojans. Zeus understands that Troy is fated to fall, and he doesn't much like it. Troy is his favorite city, and so he's feeling out the other gods on whether they might support saving Troy. Ultimately, however, despite their personal interests, the gods serve as agents to bring about what is fated. And conversations like these, where the gods talk about changing fate, always end up with the same conclusion. What is fated to be for mortals must come about. But Hera and Athene murmured thereat, who were sitting by him and devising ills for the Trojans. Now Athene held her peace and said not anything, for wrath at Father Zeus, and fierce anger gat hold upon her. But Hera's breast contained not her anger, and she spake. Most dread son of Cronos, what word is this thou hast spoken? How hast thou the will to make my labor void and of none effect, and the sweat of my toil that I sweated, when my horses were wearied with my summoning of the host, to be the plague of Priam and his sons? Do as thou wilt, but we, other gods, do not all approve thee. Then in sore anger, Zeus the cloud-gatherer spake to her, Good lady, how hath Priam and Priam's sons done thee such great wrong, that thou art furiously minded to sack the stablished citadel of Ilios? Perchance wert thou to enter within the gates and long walls, and devour Priam raw, and Priam's sons, and all the Trojans. Then mightest thou assuage thine anger. Do as thou art minded. Only let not this quarrel hereafter be to me and thee a sore strife between us both. And this moreover will I say to thee, and do thou lay it to thy heart, whene'er I too be of eager mind to lay waste a city, where is the race of men that are dear to thee, hinder thou not my wrath, but let me be, even as I yield to thee of free will, yet with soul unwilling. For of all cities beneath sun and starry heaven, that are the dwelling of mortal men, holy Ilios was most honored of my heart, and Priam, and the folk of Priam, of the good ashen spear. For never did mine altar lack the seemly feast, even drink offering and burnt offering, the worship that is our due. Then Hera, the ox-eyed queen, made answer to him, Of a surety 3 cities are there that be dearest far to me, Argos, and Sparta, and wide Mycenae. These lay thou waste whene'er they are found hateful to thy heart. Not for them will I stand forth, nor do I grudge thee them. For even if I be jealous and would forbid thee to overthrow them, yet will my jealousy not avail, seeing that thou art stronger far than I. Still must my labor too not be made of none effect. For I am also a god, and my lineage is even as thine, and Cronos the crooked counselor begat me to the place of honor in double wise, by birthright, and because I am named thy spouse, and thou art king among all the immortals. Let us indeed yield each to other herein, I to thee, and thou to me, and the rest of the immortal gods will follow with us. And do thou with speed charge Athene to betake her to the fierce battle din of Trojans and Achaeans, and to essay that the Trojans may first take upon them to do violence to the Achaeans in their triumph, despite the oaths. So said she, and the father of men and gods disregarded not. Forthwith he spake to Athene winged words. Betake thee with all speed to the host, to the midst of Trojans and Achaeans, and essay that the Trojans may first take upon them to do violence to the Achaeans in their triumph, despite the oaths. After finding that Hera and Athene had no appetite for his suggestion that the Trojans be left off easy and the gods forge a friendship between the Greeks and Trojans, Zeus has sent Athene down to the battlefield to break the truce by inciting some Trojan into committing the first violent act. As Athene makes her way down to the plains of Troy from Olympus, let's do an in-depth look at this extremely important goddess. Athene, or Athena, is the daughter of Zeus. She is often thought of as not having had a mother, and being solely the child of Zeus. If she is presented as having had a mother, that mother was the goddess Metis, the first wife of Zeus, and a goddess who represented wisdom, and more specifically a cunning, clever kind of wisdom, tricky, unexpected strategies. This is a trait that her daughter would inherit. In the Theogony of Hesiod, a work as ancient as those of Homer such as the Iliad, the birth of Athene is recorded thus. Now Zeus, king of the gods, made Metis his wife first, and she was wisest among gods and mortal men. But when she was about to bring forth the goddess bright-eyed Athene, Zeus craftily deceived her with cunning words, and put her in his own belly, as earth and starry heaven advised. For they advised him so, to the end that no other should hold royal sway over the eternal gods in place of Zeus. For very wise children were destined to be born of her. First, the maiden bright-eyed Tritogenia, equal to her father in strength and in wise understanding. But afterward she was to bear a son of overbearing spirit, king of gods and men. But Zeus put her into his own belly first, that the goddess might devise for him both good and evil. From Hesiod's account, we gather that Zeus, ever wary of the potential for begetting a child which would take the rule of the cosmos away from him, knew that Metis's powers of cunning wisdom were particularly dangerous for a child god to inherit, and he had been warned that particularly wise gods were fated to be born to her. Zeus is, however, never so very wary that he doesn't have sex with someone he desires. That's more wary than Zeus wants to be. Metis is prophesied to have two children, a daughter who would be as strong and wise as her father, and then a son who would be the king of gods and men. That son will never come about. Zeus has successfully avoided that fate by devouring Metis, and it is implied that by doing so, Zeus was able to take on her power of cunning wisdom for his own benefit. And if you're wondering how Zeus can avoid fate while also being the enforcer of fate, the answer is, it's complicated. A close reading of Hesiod's Theogony lines 211 through 225 seems to indicate that, while the fates do punish both mortal and divine transgressions, it is only to mortals that they prescribe actual fated events. Thus, we can gather that gods can be told prophecies and then take steps to avoid them, while we see consistently in mythology that any humans who are told prophecies find that any steps they take to avoid fate are useless and only result in that fate coming about anyway, as if even their attempts at avoidance have been foreseen. Zeus, rather than allowing Metis to give birth herself to this daughter who will be his equal in wisdom and strength, does something truly unexpected. He eats Metis while she's pregnant with their daughter. This results in a couple of things. First off, it prevents Metis from being around and being a temptation to him, so that Zeus doesn't have to worry about her getting pregnant with that second child, that son, who will replace him. Secondly, it will mean that Zeus is, in a way, Athene's father and her mother, because the birth of Athene is one of the strangest in all of Greek mythology. Check out the link in the show notes under Citations, Item 3. It will take you to a painting on ceramic from the 500s BCE. Here, we've got an image of a seated man with a female bearing a shield erupting from his skull, and a standing man in front of them who's holding an axe. Now, the child erupting from the skull, that's baby Athena, erupting from Zeus's skull, after Hephaestus has cracked open Zeus's skull like an egg for the infant goddess to emerge. And yes, baby Athena is already in full battle gear. That's how she's consistently depicted. She came into this world ready for battle. Athena is certainly a warrior goddess, but she's specifically the goddess of clever, cunning war. The brutality of war is left to Ares, and in ancient Greek culture, he wasn't nearly as respected as she was, because the brutality of war wasn't glorious, but rather a victory cleverly contrived. However, Athena was a goddess of much more than just war. She was also the goddess of handicrafts, weaving in particular, and in this way, she was a goddess who oversaw areas of activity of both men and women. In mythology, Athena was often a goddess who provided support to heroes, and as such, she was involved in many of the most important stories of mythology. Here in the Iliad, we've already seen her playing this role to Achilles, where she stayed his hand from murdering Agamemnon in Book 1. We'll also see her support Diomedes and Odysseus, and again Achilles later on. In fact, she is the great supporter of both Odysseus and his son Telemachus throughout the Odyssey. And she's intricately involved in the adventures of the heroes Jason and Perseus as well. Through her symbol, the owl, she's still associated with wisdom even now. And owls were famously on the coins of ancient Athens, the capital city which bears her name to this day. Her other most prominent animal symbol is the snake, as seen in the linked photo Pallas Athena with serpent. To the ancient Greeks, serpents were symbolic of the earth, with the connotation that this association with the earth meant that you were native to this place. It was important to imagine that your people, your ancestors, were inextricably tied to the place where you lived, and being arisen from the land of a place was called being autochthonos, arising oneself from the earth. Thus, although Athena was always portrayed as a virgin goddess, she had adopted a child, Erichthonios, the meaning of whose name is uncertain, but it does contain that same chthon element indicating the earth itself. Erichthonios was a strange baby, and Athena knew it, so she kept him in a basket, hidden from the world. When she asked the king's daughters to look after him for a while, she ordered them to care for the baby, but not to look at him. Well, you can guess what they did. And the sight drove them mad. They ran off the edge of the Acropolis in terror, because little baby Erichthonios was only half a human baby. His other half was a wriggling serpent, all bundled up in his cozy basket. He grew up to be a legendary early ruler of Athens, making the Athenian people in their mythology both native to Athens itself and making them children of Athena. The legends that involve Athena are endless. She is among the most thoroughly realized characters among the Olympian gods. Although we associate her most closely with the city of Athens now, it should be emphasized that Athena was truly a pan-Hellenic goddess, with temples throughout the ancient world, including Athens' main rival, the city of Sparta. Just earlier this year, I was in the city of Syracuse, Italy, originally a Greek colony allied with Sparta in ancient times. And I was able to walk right up and place my hands on the columns of the Temple of Athena, which have since been integrated into the wall of the current Christian church there. Athena in the Iliad is much like the Athena you will find throughout Greek mythology. Brilliant, brave, a strategist, a warrior, a teacher, the defender of young men and young women, and consistently her father's favorite daughter who could do no wrong in his eyes. In the Iliad, she's always an ardent and effective supporter of the Greeks. Let's join Athena as she flies down from Olympus to the battlefield of Troy, where she intends to stir things up. From Olympus's heights she darted down, even as the son of Cronos the crooked counselor sendeth a star, a portent for mariners or a wide host of men, bright shining, and therefrom are scattered sparks in multitude. Even in such guise sped Pallas Athene to earth, and leapt into their midst, and astonishment came on them that beheld, on horse-taming Trojans and well-grieved Achaeans. And thus would many an one say, looking to his neighbor, of a surety either shall sore war and the fierce battle din return again, or else Zeus doth establish peace between the foes, even he that is men's dispenser of battle. Thus would many an one of Achaeans and Trojans say. Athene is described as flying down from Olympus as a shooting star, and the soldiers comment on the sight, in daylight no less, as a sign they hope of peace, but they fear of war. There was a comet visible recently from my home in Hawaii, an amazing sight, but it could only be seen at night. Imagine the brilliance of a comet visible in daylight. This is an interesting manifestation of the goddess. The men are interpreting this sight, a shooting star, as an omen, which is a communication from the gods to mortals about something else. Another omen previously described in the Iliad was in Book 2, when Odysseus reminded the Greeks about the seer Calchas's interpretation of the omen regarding the 8 baby birds and the mother bird, who were eaten by the snake. This omen was a communication from the gods that the war would last 9 years, the 8 babies and the mother bird making 9. But here with the shooting star, there is no communication intended. And in fact, the author Jonathan Reddy points out that there are a lot of reasons why Athene's appearance here isn't an omen at all, but rather an epiphany, a manifestation of the divine. An epiphany isn't meant to communicate anything. It's simply an appearance of the divine, at which all we can do is marvel or fear. That this would happen here and now is important. In Book 3, the mortal leaders of both sides in this war had decided on a way to resolve the conflict through a winner-take-all duel. But the gods on both sides disrupted this plan. First in Book 3 with Aphrodite spiriting Paris off the battlefield, and now more definitively with Athene, appearing in the glory of her divine power as a shooting star in the sky. Her appearance will irreparably disrupt the mortals' efforts at resolving this conflict, and will condemn both sides to seeing this war through. The immortals are convincingly reasserting their power here. First off, Athene's appearance to the Greeks is confusing, clouding even their ability to understand what they're seeing. The Greeks have doubts about whether this shooting star is an omen, and if it is, how to interpret it. And they never show doubt towards omens, true omens. Secondly, they marvel at this appearance. It's an epiphany. It's an astounding miracle, an ostentatious display of divine power. But why? For no reason other than a display of power. Athene arrives on the battlefield, invisible, and she already has a plan in mind. She's looking for a Trojan, a specific Trojan, to whom she wants to appear in her role as a guide to heroes. Warriors rely on her for good guidance and strategy in battle and will trust what she has to say. But unlike when she appears to the Greeks, as she did to Achilles in Book 1, Athene is about to give her Trojan protege some bad advice. Then the goddess entered the throng of Trojans in the likeness of a man, even Antenor's son Laodocus, a stalwart warrior, and sought for godlike Pandaros, if haply she might find him. Lycaon's son found she, the noble and stalwart standing, and about him the stalwart ranks of the shield-bearing host that followed him from the streams of Aesepos. So she came near and spake winged words. Wilt thou now hearken to me, thou wise son of Lycaon? Then wouldst thou take heart to shoot a swift arrow at Menelaus, and wouldst win favor and glory before all the Trojans, and before King Alexandros most of all. Surely from him first of any wouldst thou receive glorious gifts, if perchance he see Menelaus, Atreus' warrior son, vanquished by thy dart, and brought to the grievous pyre. Go to now, shoot at glorious Menelaus, and vow to Apollo, the son of light, the lord of archery, to sacrifice a goodly hecatomb of firstling lambs, when thou art returned to thy home, in the city of holy Zelaya. This Pandaros has an unclear background in the Iliad, unusual, as most of even the minor characters have elaborate backstories and legends built up around them. Here, he's simply called the son of Lycaon. This isn't very helpful, since there were a lot of Lycaons in mythology. The name is based on the word for wolf, and one very early Lycaon was actually turned into a wolf by Zeus for the horrific crime of cooking his own son and serving him to Zeus. The Lycaon in closest proximity to the Trojan War was a son of King Priam of Troy, making Pandaros the king's grandson. But this son of Lycaon is not referred to in any way that would indicate such a close relationship with Priam. And in fact, in his later appearance in the Iliad, this Pandaros is specified as being from the country of Lycia, an ally nation of Troy that spoke a related language, but one that's far off in what is now southern Turkey. Troy is here in the north of Turkey. So this just adds to the confusion, as the Lycians at Troy are specifically said to have been led by a man named Sarpedon and aided by his friend Glaucus. Sarpedon was a mortal son of Zeus and a fairly important figure later on in the Iliad. Adding even more to the confusion of Pandaros' origin, here in Book 4, he's said to be from Zelaya, which was a village right at the foot of Mount Ida, basically a suburb of Troy. So, is he a foreigner or an unacknowledged grandson of the king of Troy? Or neither? Maybe he's a conflation of two separate characters. You can read more speculation about Pandaros in the paper by Bryce titled Pandaros, a Lycian at Troy, linked in the show notes. Here's what I'll point out about the character of Pandaros, which is consistent across his various appearances in the Iliad, even if his origin isn't. He is a well-renowned archer and very proud of this skill. Athene is taking advantage of his pride and his skill with the bow right now, causing him to imagine himself a great hero if he takes this shot at Menelaus and kills the Greek rival for Helen. Athene knows his weakness and is targeting it just as Pandaros will target Menelaus. Shoot Menelaus, Athene tells Pandaros, and Alexandros will reward you with some magnificent gift. This opportunity for greatness, underhanded as it is, may have been especially tempting to an archer proud of his skill. Archery wasn't as respected as hand-to-hand combat in battle. Those who were skilled in both archery and hand-to-hand combat typically weren't employed as archers in battle. For instance, we never see Odysseus use the bow in the Iliad, even though he's known as a great archer, and displays that skill in the Odyssey. So spake Athene, and persuaded his fool's heart. Forthwith he unsheathed his polished bow of horn of a wild ibex, that he himself had erst smitten beneath the breast as it came forth from a rock, the while he awaited in a lurking place, and had pierced it in the chest, so that it fell backward on the rock. Now from its head sprang there horns of 16 palms. These the artificer, even the worker in horn, joined cunningly together, and polished them all well, and set the tip of gold thereon. So when he had well strung it, he laid it down and rested it upon the ground, and his staunch comrades held their shields before him, lest the warrior sons of the Achaeans should first set on them, ere Menelaus, Atreus' warrior son, were smitten. Then opened he the lid of his quiver, and took forth a feathered arrow, never yet shot, a source of grievous pangs. And anon he laid the bitter dart upon the string, and vowed to Apollo, the son of light, the lord of archery, to sacrifice a goodly hecatomb of firstling lambs, when he should have returned to his home in the city of holy Zelaya. Then he took the notch and string of ox's sinew together, and drew, bringing to his breast the string, and to the bow the iron head. So when he had now bent the great bow into a round, the horn twanged, and the string sang aloud, and the keen arrow leapt, eager to wing his way amid the throng. Pandaros has taken Athene's bait, and with a promise to Apollo, god of archers, that he'll sacrifice some lambs to him once he returns home, he fires his arrow at Menelaus. Will his prayer work? Will Pandaros' arrow hit Menelaus? But the blessed gods immortal forgat not thee, Menelaus, and before all the daughter of Zeus, the driver of the spoil, who stood before thee and warded off the piercing dart. She turned it just aside from the flesh, even as a mother driveth a fly from her child that lieth in sweet slumber, and with her own hand guided it where the golden buckles of the belt were clasped, and the doubled breastplate met them. So the bitter arrow lighted upon the firm belt. Through the inwrought belt it sped, and through the curiously wrought breastplate it pressed on, and through the taslet he wore to shield his flesh, a barrier against darts. and this best shielded him, yet it passed on even through this. Then did the arrow graze the warrior's outermost flesh, and forthwith the dusky blood flowed from the wound. As when some woman of Ionia or Caria staineth ivory with purple, to make a cheek-piece for horses, and is laid up in the treasure chamber, though many a horseman prayeth to wear it, but it is laid up to be a king's boast, alike an adornment for his horse, and a glory for his charioteer. Even in such wise, Menelaus, were thy shapely thighs stained with blood, and thy legs and thy fair ankles beneath. Pandaros takes aim, and his aim may well have been true, but he can't account for Athene, who invisibly swats the arrow like a mother swatting a fly away from a sleeping baby. Now the arrow does still hit Menelaus, but we, the audience, are immediately let in on the outcome of Pandaros' shot, that while Menelaus is hit, it's not bad. The arrow has pierced through multiple layers of armor, through the breastplate, then underneath that through another piece of armor called a taslet, which is a metal belt worn below the breastplate. The taslet did a lot to protect Menelaus, so that although the arrowhead did break through, it only grazed the skin of his abdomen underneath. But the wound is bleeding. Blood is streaming down Menelaus' legs, and it's shocking to everyone, but especially to Agamemnon, who doesn't know yet that the wound isn't really all that bad. His reaction is a lot. He's a loving brother, I get it, but see what you think and whether you feel his reaction is excessive. Thereat shuddered Agamemnon, king of men, when he saw the black blood flowing from the wound. And Menelaus, dear to Ares, likewise shuddered. But when he saw how thread and barbs were without, his spirit was gathered in his breast again. Then Lord Agamemnon moaned deep and spake among them, holding Menelaus by the hand, and his comrades made moan the while. Dear brother, to thy death, meseemeth, pledged I these oaths, setting thee forth to fight the Trojans alone before the face of the Achaeans, seeing that the Trojans have so smitten thee and trodden underfoot the trusty oaths. Yet in no wise is an oath of none effect, and the blood of lambs and pure drink offerings and the right hands of fellowship wherein I have trusted. For even if the Olympian bring not about the fulfillment forthwith, yet doth he fulfill at last, and men make dear amends, even with their own heads and their wives and little ones. Yea, of a surety, I know this in heart and soul. The day shall come for holy Ilios to be laid low, and Priam and the folk of Priam of the good ashen spear, and Zeus, the son of Cronos, enthroned on high, that dwelleth in the heaven, himself shall brandish over them all his lowering aegis, in indignation at this deceit. Then shall all this not be void. Yet shall I have sorrow for thee, Menelaus, if thou die and fill up the lot of life. Yea, in utter shame should I return to thirsty Argos, seeing that the Achaeans will forthwith bethink them of their native land. And so should we leave to Priam and the Trojans their boast, even Helen of Argos. And the earth shall rot thy bones, as thou lieth in Troy, with thy task unfinished. And thus shall many an overweening Trojan say, as he leapeth upon the tomb of glorious Menelaus, Would to God Agamemnon might so fulfill his wrath in every matter, even as now he led hither the host of the Achaeans for naught, and hath gone home again to his dear native land with empty ships, and hath left noble Menelaus behind. Thus shall men say hereafter, on that day let the wide earth gape for me. At the shock of seeing his brother bleeding, struck by an arrow in violation of the sacred truce, Agamemnon feels guilty for having set up his brother to fight the duel, for his involvement in making the oaths and the sacrifice that preceded the duel. This leads his thoughts to how untrustworthy the Trojans are, and he feels a righteous certainty that Zeus will eventually bring about Troy's destruction for this treachery, because, from his perspective, there was still a truce on. It was only Paris who was supposed to fight Menelaus, and everyone else had put down their weapons and sworn to abide by the results of the duel. The Trojans had disarmed, but also Agamemnon and the other Greeks had disarmed, those who would have defended Menelaus, if not for the breach of trust committed by Pandaros. And finally, at the end of his speech, Agamemnon spirals a bit, imagining Menelaus dead and buried here in Troyland, Agamemnon himself returning home in shame because the Greeks will be unwilling to fight for Helen if the Greek who claims her, Menelaus, has been killed. And Agamemnon is now imagining Trojans leaping upon Menelaus's grave while they mock Agamemnon as a failure. It's a very self-centered little pity party fantasy he has going on here. You can follow his train of thought as he gets farther and farther away from reality and deeper into his own fears. His reaction seems like a lot to me, but once we remember just how insecure he is as a leader and as a brother, it makes sense. His train of thought ends up where his anxiety-riddled mind always ends up: fear and self-doubt. Agamemnon's journey into fear and self-doubt will continue throughout Book 4. We're not even close to the end of it, and Agamemnon will be our guide through all of it. You can read a lot more insights into his psyche in Jennifer Roberts' paper, linked in the show notes, titled Portrait of a Neurosis, Agamemnon in Book 4 of the Iliad. And we'll do a deep dive into Agamemnon's history later on in this episode. Menelaus tries to put Agamemnon's worried mind at ease. Golden-haired Menelaus encouraged him and said, "Be of good courage, neither dismay at all the host of the Achaeans. The keen dart lighted not upon a deadly spot. My glistening belt in front stayed it, and the kirtle of mail beneath, and the taslet that the coppersmiths fashioned." Then Lord Agamemnon answered him and said, "Would it may be so, dear Menelaus, but the leech shall feel the wound, and lay thereon drugs that shall assuage thy dire pangs." So saying, he spoke to godlike Talthybios, his herald. "Talthybios, with all speed call Machaon hither, the hero son of Asclepios, the noble leech, to see Menelaus, Atreus' warrior son, whom one well skilled in archery, some Trojan or Lycian, hath wounded with a bowshot, to his glory and our grief." So said he, and the herald heard him and disregarded not, and went his way through the host of mail-clad Achaeans to spy out the hero Machaon. Him he found standing, and about him the stalwart ranks of the shield-bearing host that followed him from Trike, pasture land of horses. So he came near and spake his winged words. "Arise, thou son of Asclepios. Lord Agamemnon calleth thee to see Menelaus, captain of the Achaeans, whom one well skilled in archery, some Trojan or Lycian, hath wounded with a bowshot, to his glory and our grief." So saying, he aroused his spirit in his breast, and they went their way amid the throng, through the wide host of the Achaeans. And when they were now come where was golden-haired Menelaus wounded, and all as many as were chieftains gathered around him in a circle, the godlike hero came and stood in their midst, and anon drew forth the arrow from the clasped belt. And as it was drawn forth, the keen barbs were broken backwards. Then he loosed the glistening belt, and the kirtle of mail beneath, and taslet that the coppersmiths fashioned. And when he saw the wound, where the bitter arrow had halted, he sucked out the blood, and cunningly spread thereon soothing drugs, such as Chiron of his goodwill had imparted to his sire. So Agamemnon still isn't satisfied hearing Menelaus say it isn't too bad. He's afraid, and his fear isn't entirely unreasonable. There was always the possibility that the arrow had been poisoned, which was not unheard of. In the previous generation of heroes, Heracles was known to have used arrows poisoned with the blood of the Hydra. And in the Odyssey, Athene tells the story to Odysseus' son Telemachus of his father Odysseus having sought a poison to dip his arrow tips in, and being granted that poison by Zeus. Thus, the fear Agamemnon has that even a minor arrow wound may still mean death for Menelaus is reasonable. The Greeks now encircle Menelaus, protecting him from the Trojan army, which is still in the field. Agamemnon calls for the physician Machaon, the son of the physician god Asclepios. Open battle has not yet resumed. We can imagine there is an unnatural silence across the battlefield as the Trojans and all the regular soldiers among the Greeks are peering at this circle of Greek leaders surrounding Menelaus. What will come of this? Has the Greek contender for Helen's hand been slain? And if so, Will the Greeks just walk away from the war? Or will they seek revenge and war unceasing until the final destruction of one side or the other? The hope for a swift resolution through single combat seems to be fading. This hope Pandarus' arrow is likely to have destroyed already. The physician Machaon arrives and is quickly brought into the circle. He kneels next to Menelaus and removes Menelaus' armor, the breastplate, and that metal belt, the taslet, through which the arrowhead has lodged itself. The arrowhead comes away from the wound along with the belt, and Menelaus gasps at the sharp change in pain. Wiping away the copious amounts of blood oozing from Menelaus' abdomen, Machaon catches a quick glimpse of the wound before the blood wells up again. And then he smiles. Agamemnon catches his breath, his anxious eyes darting between those of his brother and the physician and the bloody wound. Why would the physician have smiled? But Machaon doesn't pause to answer any questions. Instead, he leans forward, places his mouth to the wound, and sucks out the blood. Then he spits it on the ground by Menelaus' side. Machaon does this several times. Agamemnon knows why he does this. It's his worst fear, and he watches this happen, closely following every movement and every expression of his brother and the physician. Is it poison? Does Machaon taste poison mingled with the blood? And is it too little too late for the doctor to suck it out now? Finally, Machaon ceases purging the wound and dresses it using medicinal herbs, as was taught to his father by Chiron the wise centaur. We leave this scene now, uncertain about Menelaus' recovery. Book 4 changes gears now, and from the events that have been taking place recently, you might expect that we're going to see battle break out instantly. That would be a reasonable assumption. After all, the Trojans just violated a sacred truce by attempting to kill Menelaus, the brother of the Greeks' high king. But this isn't quite where we're going next. We're still following Agamemnon. He's the character through whose eyes we see most of Book 4. And that means we're with Agamemnon for all of his emotional turbulence, his anxiety, his self-doubt, and his almost neurotic need to reassure himself that he really does have this army at his back. So, for the next part of Book 4, we're going to accompany Agamemnon as he goes on a very thorough inspection of the Greek army. Only once he's satisfied himself that the army is well and truly with him will the battle commence. We will get to it, but Agamemnon isn't ready for it yet, so down into the neurosis we go with him. Before we get to his inspection tour of the Greek army, let's take this opportunity to understand Agamemnon a little better. Who is this high king of the Greeks? As we've seen so far in the Iliad, he is a very insecure leader, and he's already made some missteps, including prioritizing his own honor, resulting in their best warrior, Achilles, taking himself out of the war. And more recently, he misjudged just how dissatisfied the army was with the war, nearly leading to a general mutiny of the troops. Agamemnon came from a cursed line, the most famously cursed line of kings in all of ancient Greece. His father was Atreus, from whom he inherited the kingdom of Mycenae. This was one of the most important city-states of Greece in the 2nd millennium BCE. Although by the time of classical Greece, when the Iliad was being compiled into its final form we have now, Mycenae had faded from its prior glory. But at the time of the Iliad, it was still a major power. From Mycenae, we've come to name the entire civilization of similar cities throughout Greece at the time, the Mycenaean Greeks of the late Bronze Age, based primarily on mainland Greece, were the dominant civilization in the region, following the earlier dominance of the Minoans based on the island of Crete. The city of Mycenae itself is at the northeastern portion of the Peloponnesus, north of the Argolic Gulf, and in its ruins stands still the famous Lion Gate, which was built around 1250 BCE and was described by ancient writers. Its uniqueness leaves no doubt that this was the city which the Agamemnon of Homer is said to have ruled. Among the other artifacts recovered from this site is the so-called Death Mask of Agamemnon. While almost certainly not an actual image of Agamemnon, it is one of a handful of gold masks found at Mycenae. The discoverer of these gold masks, Heinrich Schliemann, seems to have actually thought of a different one of these masks as representing Agamemnon than the one we currently do now. As it turns out, all of these masks are actually older than the date range in which the Trojan War would have taken place. But having seen these masks myself at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, I can say that it was still an eerie sight, even just to imagine that I was beholding the face of Agamemnon, and I allowed myself the luxury of pretending for that moment that it really was him. I've placed a link to an image of the so-called Mask of Agamemnon in the show notes. These masks, however, are images of actual people, and we should be cautious about conflating real historical figures with someone as mythological as Agamemnon, although I have to admit that I really love these magical places and spaces where mythology touches reality. Back firmly in the world of mythology now, Agamemnon's entire family history is one of really epic tragedy. His great-grandfather Tantalus was, in many accounts, a son of Zeus, and it was with Tantalus that the family curse began. Tantalus had been invited to dine with the gods, but he tried stealing their sacred food and drink, the ambrosia and nectar. Later, Tantalus made a terrible sacrifice to the gods. He cut up and cooked his own son, Pelops, into a stew, and then served this grisly dinner to the gods. Only the goddess Demeter tasted of this dish, and only because she was still distracted from the kidnapping of her daughter Persephone. Tantalus would spend the rest of eternity being tortured in Hades for this sin. Fortunately for Agamemnon, his grandfather Pelops, for whom the entire Peloponnesus was named, technically a peninsula, the name means Pelops' isle, Pelops had already begotten twin sons before his father Tantalus cooked him into a stew. These sons, Thyestes and Atreus, who was the father of Agamemnon and Menelaus. Pelops and Menelaus seem to be the only men in this line who didn't commit any terrible sins in their lives. Atreus and Thyestes both certainly committed a number of egregious sins. They had an ongoing feud as they battled for the throne of Mycenae, but their criminal careers began together when they murdered their other brother, Chrysippus. Later, when Atreus learned that Thyestes was sleeping with his wife, Atreus got his revenge by killing Thyestes' sons and tricking Thyestes into eating them. More cannibalism in this family. But Thyestes had the final word between those two brothers, however. By following an oracle that prophesied he could overcome Atreus if he committed incest, Thyestes' son/grandson, yeah, that means what it sounds like, Aegisthus, murdered Atreus. And this put Thyestes firmly on the throne, and young Agamemnon and Menelaus then had to go into exile. So these young Atreides brothers, Agamemnon and Menelaus, were welcomed into the royal palace at Sparta, where King Tyndareus found he really liked them. Tyndareus helped Agamemnon win back the throne of Mycenae from his uncle Thyestes, who then was forced into exile himself. And if you remember back to Book 3, you might recognize Tyndareus as the mortal father of Helen. Later, Tyndareus further built the bond of friendship by letting Agamemnon marry his daughter Clytemnestra. But as you'll recall, Tyndareus was reluctant to let anyone marry Helen. Due to her extreme beauty, Helen had a lot of suitors, and most of the leading men of Greece were interested in her. So Tyndareus was afraid to say yes to any one of them, because that would mean saying no to the rest of them. But we can imagine he was interested in furthering his bond with the powerful Atreides brothers, especially now that Agamemnon was ruling the important neighboring city of Mycenae. Agamemnon appeared as a proxy suitor for Helen in lieu of Menelaus, who was too shy to approach Helen himself. Thus, while Agamemnon is not technically listed among the suitors of Helen, he does stand in Menelaus' place as his defender in a way, and as in all things, Agamemnon feels responsible for his younger brother, even placing Menelaus' needs above his own at times. Helen was given the freedom to choose her own husband from among all these suitors, once Odysseus had suggested, and then Tyndareus agreed, to the binding oath of Tyndareus, which required all the suitors to pledge to defend the marriage of whichever among them ended up marrying Helen. And Helen, who had certainly met Menelaus when he and Agamemnon had been living in Sparta during their time as exiles, Helen chose Menelaus as her husband. And Tyndareus must have been gratified at her decision, which furthered their family's bond with the Atreides. Having pressed and successfully won his brother's suit for Helen's hand in marriage, Agamemnon had done a great thing for his brother. And not only did he win the most beautiful woman in the world from Menelaus, but by doing so, he also put Menelaus on the throne of Sparta, as Tyndareus' bond with the brothers was so strong that he abdicated the throne in favor of his new son-in-law. So Agamemnon has spent his younger years seemingly being a much better brother to Menelaus than his father and uncle had been to one another. Agamemnon is really committed to Menelaus, and up until this point in their lives, Agamemnon can unequivocally be said to be a good person. But that would not last, and in fact it would be Agamemnon's commitment to his brother Menelaus that would be his undoing. Once the Trojan prince Alexandros had kidnapped Helen, Agamemnon's feeling that he needed to defend his younger brother really kicked into high gear. And for the first time in ancient Greek mythology, all the nations of Greece were committed to a single military endeavor due to the relentless rallying of Agamemnon in defense of the oath of Tyndareus and his brother's marriage. Earlier myths involved Greeks of various cities working together, but those were always quests with limited numbers of participants, such as Jason and the Argonauts or the Caledonian boar hunt. The Trojan War was on a whole other scale. This was a full mobilization of the Greek nations. This was the next great act Agamemnon did for Menelaus, after winning him the beautiful Helen and the throne of Sparta. Rallying the Greeks required Agamemnon to enforce Odysseus' oath of Tyndareus. Remember, Agamemnon hadn't been among the suitors himself, yet he always pursued the war as if he were among the oath-bound, still standing as his brother's suitor by proxy. While the Greek army was still making its way to Troy, they had assembled at a place in Greece called Aulis. Their ships were ready at the coast here, and they planned to embark for Troy soon. But there was no wind, so they would be unable to raise their sails and reach Troy. The seer, Calchas, was asked to tell them what god was upset with them and how they could placate that god and get the wind back. And it was this interaction which caused Agamemnon to bear the grudge against Calchas that we saw he still bore him in Book 1. Calchas said it was the goddess Artemis who was angry with them, and that her anger was Agamemnon's fault. The story came out how Agamemnon had hunted and killed one of Artemis's deer within her sacred grove. Then he'd followed that up by boasting that he was a better hunter than her. A mortal boasting over a god is never tolerated. For that reason, Artemis would only accept one thing to restore the winds. Calchas let them know that Artemis demanded that Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia, be sacrificed. What a horrible demand she was making, and what a difficult situation for Agamemnon to have been in. He was essentially having to choose between his daughter's life and his brother's honor. Now, here in modern times, I'd venture to say that most of us would choose life over honor. But those were different times, and my interpretation of Agamemnon is that he's imbalanced when it comes to the subject of Menelaus, that he's making up for his father and uncle's rivalry, perhaps, by trying too hard to be a good brother. So it was here at Aulis that Agamemnon committed his great sin. With subterfuge, Agamemnon told his wife Clytemnestra that Achilles wanted to marry their daughter. And so when his wife brought their daughter in a bridal gown to the altar to marry the greatest hero of the Greeks, Agamemnon sacrificed his own daughter. And while a goddess had demanded it, this in no way lessens Agamemnon's guilt for this act. For one thing, it was his violation against Artemis's divine dignity in the first place, which had caused her to make this terrible demand. His hunting her deer in her sacred grove, and his boasting that he was better at the thing that she is the goddess of. These acts of Agamemnon's are what caused the goddess to demand his daughter in the first place. And even some ancient writers struggled with the idea that Artemis really meant for Iphigenia to die. And we see in some versions of the story that Iphigenia was magically replaced by a deer on the altar at the last moment, absolving the goddess of her part of this crime, but leaving Agamemnon wielding the knife just as guilty, in a sort of twist on the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. In these versions of the story, Iphigenia was whisked away to a faraway land where she became a priestess of Artemis. But as far as Agamemnon's guilt is concerned, Artemis's anger was irrelevant. Guilt in ancient Greece was for violating the cultural norm, regardless of any extenuating circumstances. When Agamemnon's uncle Thyestes was tricked into eating his own children, it didn't matter that he was unaware he was committing the crime of cannibalism. He had to go into exile for cannibalism anyway. Thus, even now, Agamemnon knows that he's already transgressed a line. He killed his own daughter. However well-intentioned he started off in his defense of his younger brother, which rallied for the first time all Greece in a common cause, he is guilty. Agamemnon has to fear that the Furies, those goddesses of revenge, will seek him out one day and deliver his punishment. So, can we gain any insights into Agamemnon's mind from his personal and family history? His mistrust of others makes sense, given how awful his father and great-grandfather were to their family members. The fact that he wants so badly to be a good brother speaks well of Agamemnon's character, but he takes this too far. Does Agamemnon mistrust himself? Maybe. His ancestors were all iconic figures in history, and most of them ended up doing some awful things. With his self-doubt, his fear of falling into his ancestral curse, and guilt for the sin he's already committed. This upcoming section of Book 4 makes plenty of sense. Next, we're going to follow Agamemnon as he does a thorough inspection of the troops. And this is another of those little episodes of the Iliad that has its own name among scholars. This is called the epipolesis. Along the way, Agamemnon will compliment and insult the men, and some of them will snap back at him. At times, it even seems as if Agamemnon is intentionally agitating some of them, Diomedes in particular. Agamemnon may seem aimless in this wandering, but it's all to reassure himself that they'll be with him in the battle. And you'll notice that this inspection tour, the epipolesis, takes place during the battle, and yet there's little focus on the battle itself. Somehow, everyone can carry on a conversation with Agamemnon while they're fighting. It's a strange interlude, and it just adds to the sense that we're inside Agamemnon's troubled mind here in Book 4. So let's continue with the text of the Iliad. While these were tending Menelaus of the loud war cry, the ranks of shield-bearing Trojans came on. So the Achaeans donned their arms again, and bethought them of the fray. Now wouldst thou not see noble Agamemnon slumbering, nor cowering, nor unready to fight, but very eager for glorious battle. He left his horses and chariot adorned with bronze, and his squire, even Eurymedon, son of Ptolemaeus, Pyrrhaeus' son, kept apart the snorting steeds, and he straightly charged him to have them at hand whenever weariness should come upon his limbs with marshalling so many. And thus on foot ranged he through the ranks of warriors. And whomsoever of all the fleet-horsed Danaans he found eager, he stood by them, and by his words encouraged them. Ye Argives, relax not in any wise your impetuous valor, for Father Zeus will be no helper of liars. But as these were first to transgress against the oaths, so shall their own tender flesh be eaten of the vultures, and we shall bear away their dear wives and little children in our ships, when once we have taken the stronghold. But whomsoever he found shrinking from hateful battle, those he chode sore with angry words. Ye Argives, Warriors of the bow, ye men of dishonor, have ye no shame? Why stand ye thus dazed like fawns that are weary with running over the long plain, and so stand still, and no valor is found in their hearts at all? Even thus stand ye dazed, and fight not. Is it that ye wait for the Trojans to come near where your good ships' sterns are drawn up on the shore of the gray sea, to know if Cronion will stretch his arms over you indeed? So first, in his epipolasis, or inspection of the troops, Agamemnon is going to come across Idomeneus, the king of Crete, who was a great friend of the Atreides, and of Menelaus in particular. And always with Idomeneus is his companion, Meriones. Agamemnon has only good things to say to Idomeneus. So masterfully ranged he through the ranks of warriors. Then he came to the Cretans, as he went through the throng of warriors, and these were taking arms around wise Idomeneus. Idomeneus, amid the foremost, valiant as a wild boar, and Meriones the while was hastening his hindermost battalions. Then Agamemnon, king of men, rejoiced to see them, and anon spake to Idomeneus with kindly words. Idomeneus, more than all the fleet horse Danaans do I honor thee, whether in war or in task of other sort, or in the feast, when the chieftains of the Argives mingle in the bowl the gleaming wine of the counselors. For even though all the other flowing-haired Achaeans drink one allotted portion, yet thy cup standeth ever full, even as mine, to drink as oft as thy soul biddeth thee. Now arouse thee to war, like such an one as thou avowest thyself to be of old. And Idomeneus, the captain of the Cretans, made answer to him, Atreides, of very truth will I be to thee a trusty comrade, even as at the first I promised and gave my pledge. But do thou urge on all the flowing-haired Achaeans, that we may fight with all speed, seeing the Trojans have disannulled the oaths. But for all that death and sorrow hereafter shall be their lot, because they were first to transgress against the oaths. Next, Agamemnon will encounter the two Aiases, or Ajaxes, Ajax the Greater, aka Telamonian Ajax, son of Telamon, who is one of the Argonauts, a great hero of the previous generation, and brother of Peleus, father of Achilles, making Telamonian Ajax and Achilles first cousins. The two Aiases are also called the Iantes in some texts. Telamonian Ajax is the greatest Greek warrior now that Achilles has sidelined himself. He's also the leader of the fighters from Salamis, a large island near Athens. Ajax the Lesser, or, as I'm sure he would prefer to be called, Oilean Ajax, is the son of the king of Locria in central Greece, a skillful spearman, and the second faster runner after Achilles. We'll consistently see the two Aiases fighting together, even though they're from different Greek cities, because they're such good friends. And you may notice that some texts call them Ajax, some call them Aias. I will tend to use Aias as that's closer to the original Greek. Like Idomeneus, Agamemnon has only praise for the Aiases. Then came he to the Iantes, as he went through the throng of warriors, and these twain were arming, and a cloud of footmen followed with them. Even as when a goatherd from a place of outlook seeth a cloud coming across the deep before the blast of the west wind, and to him being afar, it seemeth ever blacker, even as pitch, as it goeth along the deep, and bringeth a great whirlwind, and he shuddereth to see it, and driveth his flock beneath a cave. Even in such wise moved the serried battalions of young men, the fosterlings of Zeus, by the side of the Iantes into furious war, battalions dark of line, bristling with shields and spears. And Lord Agamemnon rejoiced to see them, and spake to them winged words, and said, Iantes, leaders of the mail-clad Argives, to you twain, seeing it is not seemly to urge you, give I no charge. For of your own selves ye do indeed bid your folk to fight amain. Ah, Father Zeus and Athene and Apollo, would that all had like spirit in their breasts. Then would King Priam's city soon bow captive and wasted beneath our hands. Next, Agamemnon encounters Nestor, the very elderly king from Pylos in the western Peloponnesus. The brilliant piece of strategy Nestor offers Agamemnon is to keep all his most cowardly soldiers in the middle, surrounded and pushed forward by ones he trusts will move forward toward the fight. As I've said before, I'm never all that impressed with Nestor's alleged wisdom. He also advises his warriors to stick together. Good advice there, I'm sure, but fairly obvious, isn't it? And to attack chariot drivers with their spears. But we mostly see chariots in the Iliad used to convey warriors of status to and from battle. They're not really used much in battle offensively. Chariots in the Iliad are mostly for transportation. So saying, he left them there and went to others. Then he found Nestor, the clear-voiced orator of the Pylians, arraying his comrades and urging them to fight. Around great Pelagon and Alastor and Chromios and Lord Haemon and Bias, shepherd of the host. And first he arrayed the horsemen with horses and chariots, and behind them the footmen, many and brave, to be a bulwark of battle. But the cowards he drave into the midst, that every man, even though he would not, yet of necessity must fight. First he laid charge upon the horsemen. These he bade hold in their horses, nor be entangled in the throng. Neither let any man, trusting in his horsemanship and manhood, be eager to fight the Trojans alone before the rest, nor let him draw back, for so will ye be enfeebled. But whensoever a warrior from the place of his own car can come forward at a chariot of the foe, let him thrust forth with his spear. Even so is the far better way. Thus, moreover, did men of old time lay low cities and walls, because they had this mind and spirit in their breast. So did the old man charge them, being well skilled of yore in battles. And Lord Agamemnon rejoiced to see him, and spake to him winged words, and said, Old man, would to God that, even as thy spirit is in thine own breast, thy limbs might obey, and thy strength be unabated. But the common lot of age is heavy upon thee. Would that it had come upon some other man, and thou wert amid the young. Then knightly Nestor of Gerenia answered him, Atrides, I verily, even I too, would wish to be as on the day when I slew noble Eruthalion. But the gods in no wise grant men all things at once. As I was then a youth, so doth old age now beset me. Yet even so will I abide among the horsemen, and urge them by counsel and words. For that is the right of elders. But the young men shall wield the spear, they that are more youthful than I, and have confidence in their strength. So next, Agamemnon is going to come across Menestheus, leader of the Athenians, with Odysseus among them. Odysseus is actually from an island off the western coast of Greece called Ithaca, while Athens is on the eastern side of the Greek mainland. On the island of Ithaca, the ruins of a Mycenaean-era palace have been found on the north shore, which bolsters the idea that there were Greeks of this era established on that rocky island who could have joined a real historical Trojan War. These ruins are at a location that, to my mind, as I scroll around on Google Maps, fits the description of his home area that we find in the Odyssey very well. But of course, that may just be wishful thinking on my part. Still, I love that there are these real locations tied to the story. As we move forward into further episodes, I'll talk more about the real sites tied to the Trojan War, including what some believe are the tomb mounds of Greek warriors still there on the plains of Troy. Definitely on my vacation wish list someday. Agamemnon is going to mouth off to Menestheus and Odysseus, unnecessarily doubting Odysseus' courage. And Odysseus will snap back and say, "What's this that has escaped the barrier of your teeth?" representing his words as something physical that's come out of his mouth. Kind of like the dream in Book 2, a very real way of picturing something that we would see as insubstantial. Agamemnon will apologize quickly to Odysseus. His insults are uncalled for, and I think it's just a manifestation of his anxiety that he said anything negative at all to Odysseus, one of his best, most experienced warriors. Here's that text. So spake he, and Atrides passed on glad at heart. He found Menestheus, the charioteer, the son of Peteos, standing still, and around him were the Athenians, masters of the battle cry. And hard by stood crafty Odysseus, and round about him the ranks of the Cephallenians, no feeble folk, stood still, for their hosts had not yet heard the battle cry, seeing the battalions of horse-taming Trojans and Achaeans had but just bestirred them to move. So these stood still, tarrying some time. Other column of the Achaeans should advance to set upon the Trojans and begin the battle. But when Agamemnon, king of men, saw it, he upbraided them and spake to them winged words, saying, O son of King Peteos, fatherling of Zeus, and thou skilled in evil wiles, thou cunning of mind, Why stand ye shrinking apart, and tarry for others? You beseemeth it to stand in your place amid the foremost, and to front the fiery battle, for ye are the first to hear my bidding to the feast, as oft as we Achaeans prepare a feast for the counsellors. Then are ye glad to eat roast meat, and drink your cups of honey-sweet wine, as long as ye will. But now would ye gladly behold it, yea, if 10 columns of Achaeans in front of you were fighting with the pitiless sword. But Odysseus of many counsels looked fiercely at him and said, Atrides, what word is this that hath escaped the barrier of thy lips? How sayest thou that we are slack in battle? When once our Achaeans launch furious war on the Trojans, tamers of horses, then shalt thou, if thou wilt, and if thou takest thought therefore, behold Telemachus' dear father mingling with the champions of the Trojans, the tamers of horses. But that thou sayest is empty as air. Then Lord Agamemnon spake to him smiling, seeing how he was wroth, and took back his saying, Heaven-sprung son of Laertes, Odysseus, full of devices, neither do I chide thee beyond measure, nor urge thee. For I know that thy heart within thy breast is kindly disposed, for thy thoughts are as my thoughts. Go now, we will make amends hereafter, if any ill word hath been spoken now. May the gods bring it all to none effect. Next, Agamemnon is going to come across Diomedes, son of the hero Tydeus, and his friend Stheneas, both leaders of the actual Argives, meaning the literal city of Argos, for which sometimes all the Greeks are referred to by the author when he says Argives. Agamemnon, again to Diomedes, says things that cast doubt on the courage, again of someone whose courage is not really doubtful. Agamemnon's insecurity as a leader is more what's coming out here. Diomedes in particular should not be doubted as a hero. While he may actually be the youngest of the kings among the Greeks, younger even than Achilles, he and his friend are both of a group called the Epigoni, sons of the previous generation of 7 men who fought against but lost against the city of Thebes. Their fathers were the 7 against Thebes. The Epigoni, however, unlike their fathers, were able to defeat that famed city and tore down the famous walls of Thebes. Diomedes is among the most powerful Greek warriors, and along with Achilles and Odysseus, he is a favorite of Athene. And Diomedes has come to this war fresh off his great success in that previous war. Diomedes carries with him a round shield with the insignia of a boar on it, which was blessed by Athene herself. And he wears a breastplate that was made by the god Hephaestus. And I think he was the only Greek, other than Achilles himself, who had divinely made armor on during the Trojan War. Diomedes' friend wants to defend him, but Diomedes very politely points out that as leader of this whole expedition, it's actually Agamemnon who will bear any dishonor if it fails. So saying, he left them there and went on to others. The son of Tydeus found he, high-hearted Diomedes, standing still with horses and chariot well compact, and by him stood Sthenelos, son of Capaneus. Him Lord Agamemnon saw, and upbraided, and spake to him winged words, and said, Ah me, thou son of wise Tydeus, tamer of horses, why shrinkest thou? Why gazest thou at the highways of the battle? Not thus was Tydeus wont to shrink, but rather to fight his enemies far in front of his dear comrades, as they say that beheld him at the task. For never did I meet him, nor behold him. But men say that he was preeminent amid all. Of a truth, he came to Mycenae, not in enmity, but as a guest with godlike Polynices, to raise him an army for the war that they were levying against the holy walls of Thebes. And they besought earnestly that valiant allies might be given them. And our folk were fain to grant them, and made assent to their entreaty. Only Zeus showed omens of ill, and turned their minds. So when these were departed, and were come on their way, and had attained to Asopos deep in rushes, that maketh his bed in grass, there did the Achaeans appoint Tydeus to be their ambassador. So he went, and found the multitude of the sons of Cadmos feasting in the palace of mighty Eteocles. Yet was knightly Tydeus, even though a stranger, not afraid to be alone amid the multitude of the Cadmeans, but challenged them all to feats of strength, and in every one vanquished he them easily. So present a helper was Athene unto him. But the Cadmeans, the urgers of horses, were wroth, and as he fared back again, they brought and set a strong ambush. Even 50 young men, whose leaders were twain, Maon, son of Hymen, like to the immortals, and Autophonus' son, Polyphontes, staunch in battle. Still, even on these Tydeus brought shameful death, and slew them all, save one that he sent home again, Maon, to wit he sent away in obedience to the omens of heaven. Such was Tydeus of Aetolia, but he begat a son that in battle is worse than he, only in harangue is he the better. So said he, and stalwart Diomedes made no answer, but had respect to the chiding of the king revered. But the son of glorious Capaneus answered him, Atrides, utter not falsehood, seeing thou knowest how to speak truly. We avow ourselves to be better men by far than our fathers were. We did take the seat of Thebes, the seven-gated, though we led a scantier host against a stronger wall, because we followed the omens of the gods and the salvation of Zeus. But they perished by their own iniquities. Do not thou, therefore, in any wise have our fathers in like honor with us. But stalwart Diomedes looked sternly at him and said, Brother, sit silent and obey my saying. I grudge not that Agamemnon, shepherd of the host, should urge on the well-grieved Achaeans to fight. For him the glory will attend if the Achaeans lay the Trojans low and take holy Ilios, and his will be the great sorrow if the Achaeans be laid low. Go to now. Let us too bethink us of impetuous valor. He spake, and leapt in his armor from the chariot to earth, and terribly rang the bronze upon the chieftain's breast as he moved. Thereat might fear have come even upon one stout-hearted. And this is the end of the Epipolesis, Agamemnon's inspection tour of the Greek army. Of course, the battle has been going on during his tour, ever since Machaon came to treat Menelaus, in fact. But we now leave the restriction of Agamemnon's viewpoint of the battle. The text now moves into a beautiful metaphor describing the movement of the Greek army toward battle as a wild sea crashing upon the coast. As when on the echoing beach, the sea wave lifteth up itself in close array before the driving of the west wind. Out on the deep doth it raise first its head, and then breaketh upon the land, and belloweth aloud, and goeth with arching crest about the promontories, and speweth the foaming brine afar. Even so in close array move the battalions of the Danaans, without pause to battle. Each captain gave his men the word, and the rest went silently. Thou wouldst not deem that all the great hosts following them had any voice within their breasts. In silence feared they their captains. On every man glittered the pictured armor wherewith they went clad. But for the Trojans, like sheep beyond number that stand in the courtyard of a man of great substance, to be milked of their white milk, and bleat without ceasing to hear the lambs cry. Even so arose the clamor of the Trojans through the wide host. For they had not all like speech, nor one language, but their tongues were mingled, and they were brought from many lands. These were urged on of Ares, and those of bright-eyed Athene, and terror and rout, and strife whose fury wearieth not, sister and friend of murderous Ares. Her crest is but lowly at the first, but afterward she holdeth up her head in heaven, and her feet walk upon the earth. She now cast common discord in their midst, as she fared through the throng, and made the lamentation of men to wax. And now we will get into real description of the actual battle, and it is gory. Maybe you're ready for it, and maybe you're not, but here we are regardless. Right away, we're going to get passages like, and he drave the spear into his brow, and the point of bronze passed within the bone. Darkness clouded his eyes, and he crashed like a tower amidst the press of fight. Combat sections like this tend to focus on individual combat, and often they will include little snippets of biography about the slayers and the slain. For instance, in this upcoming section, Odysseus will be enraged by the killing of his comrade Leucos, and in return he will kill Democoon, for whom we'll get biographical details, like that he was Priam's bastard son that had come into him from tending his fleet mares in Abydos. So even just from that little snippet, we're going to learn some things. We learned that he had raised horses for Priam, and that he had come up from a ways north of the city of Troy, where Abydos was. Biographical details like this give a bit of humanity to the many warriors that we will see in the tumult of war. And it's from these snippets, along with references in related works, that ancient writers built up a whole universe, a whole interconnected world of details about nearly every named character in the Iliad. Now, when they were met together and come unto one spot, then clashed they, targe and spear, and fury of bronze-clad warrior. The bossed shields pressed each onto each, and mighty din arose. Then were heard the voices of groaning and the voice of triumph together of the slayers and the slain, and the earth streamed with blood. As when the torrents of winter flow down the mountains to a water's meet and join their furious floods through the deep ravine from their great springs, and the shepherd heareth the roaring from afar among the hills. Even so, from the joining of battle came there forth shouting and travail. Antilochus first slew a Trojan warrior in full array, valiant amid the champions. Echepolus, son of Thalcios, him was he first to smite upon the ridge of his crested helmet, and he drave the spear into his brow, and the point of bronze passed within the bone. Darkness clouded his eyes, and he crashed like a tower amid the press of fight. As he fell, Lord Elephenor caught him by the foot, Chalcodon's son, captain of the great-hearted Abantes, and dragged him from beneath the darts, eager with all speed to despoil him of his armor. Yet but for a little endured his essay. Great-hearted Agenor saw him haling away the corpse, and where his side was left uncovered of his buckler as he bowed him down, there smote he him with bronze-tipped spear shaft and unstrung his limbs. So his life departed from him, and over his corpse the task of Trojans and Achaeans grew hot. Like wolves leapt they one at another, and man lashed at man. Next, Telamonian Aias smote Anthemian's son, the lusty stripling Simoisios, whom erst his mother bare beside the banks of Simois on the way down from Ida, whither she had followed with her parents to see their flocks. Therefore they called him Simoisios, but he repaid not his dear parents the recompense of his nurture. Scanty was his span of life, by reason of the spear of great-hearted Aias that laid him low. For as he went, he first was smitten on the right breast beside the pap, straight through his shoulder past the spear of bronze, and he fell to the ground in the dust like a poplar tree that hath grown up smooth in the lowland of a great marsh, and its branches grow upon the tree-top there. Of this hath a Wainwright felled with gleaming steel, to bend him a felloe for a goodly chariot, and so it lies drying by the river's banks. In such fashion did heaven-sprung Aias slay Simoisios, son of Anthemion. Then at him Antiphos of the glancing corselet, Priam's son, made a cast with his keen javelin across the throng. Him he missed, but smote Odysseus's valiant comrade Leucos in the groin, as he drew the corpse his way, so that he fell upon it, and the body dropped from his hands. Then Odysseus was very wroth at heart for the slaying of him, and strode through the forefront of the battle, harnessed in flashing bronze, and went and stood hard by, and glanced round him, and cast his bright javelin, and the Trojans shrank back before the casting of the hero. He sped not the dart in vain, but smote Democoon, Priam's bastard son, that had come to him from tending his fleet mares in Abydos. Him Odysseus, being wroth for his comrade's sake, smote with his javelin on one temple, and through both temples passed the point of bronze, and darkness clouded his eyes, and he fell with a crash, and his armor clanged upon him. Then the forefighters and glorious Hector yielded, and the Argives shouted aloud, and drew the bodies unto them, and pressed yet further onward. But Apollo looked down from Pergamos, and had indignation, and with a shout called to the Trojans, Arise, ye Trojans, tamers of horses, yield not to the Argives in fight. Not of stone, nor iron is their flesh, that it should resist the piercing bronze when they are smitten. Moreover, Achilles, son of Thetis of the fair tresses, fighteth not, but amid the ships broodeth on his bitter anger. So spake the dread god from the city. And the Achaeans likewise were urged on of Zeus's daughter, the Triton-born, most glorious, as she passed through the throng, wheresoever she beheld them slackening. You might have noticed a lot of fighting over corpses already, and that's very, very standard, and we will see a lot of it. Remember, stuff equals glory. So the warriors are trying to nab the corpses and pull them back behind their side's lines so they can strip them of the valuable weapons and armor, and then maybe even later ransom the body back to the slayin's family members. And this is done by everyone all the time without regard to any military strategic objectives in the war. It is just a part of the culture at the time. Next was Diores, son of Amoryncaeus, caught in the snare of fate, for he was smitten by a jagged stone on the right leg, hard by the ankle, and the caster thereof was the captain of the men of Thrace, Pyrrhos, son of Ambrasos, that had come from Ainos. The pitiless stone crushed utterly the two sinews and the bones. Back he fell in the dust, and stretched out both his hands to his dear comrades, gasping out his soul. Then he that smote him, even Pyrrhos, sprang at him and pierced him with a spear beside the navel, so all his bowels gushed forth upon the ground, and darkness clouded his eyes. But even as Pyrrhos departed from him, Thoas of Aetolia smote him with a spear at his chest above the pap, and the point fixed in his lung. Then Thoas came close, and plucked out from his breast the ponderous spear, and drew his sharp sword, wherewith he smote his belly in the middle, and took his life. Yet he stripped not off his armor, for his comrades, the men of Thrace that wear the topknot, stood around, their long spears in their hands, and albeit he was great and valiant and proud, they drave him off from them, and he gave ground reeling. So were the two captains stretched in the dust side by side, he of the Thracians, and he of the mail-clad Apians, and around them there were many others likewise slain. Now would none any more enter in and make light of the battle. Could it be that a man yet unwounded by dart or thrust of keen bronze might roam in the midst, being led of Pallas Athene by the hand, and by her guarded from the flying shafts? For many Trojans that day and many Achaeans were laid side by side upon their faces in the dust. So, as you saw a little bit ago, Apollo has joined the Trojans upon the battlefield to counter the presence of Athene for the Greeks. And the presence of gods on the field, and these two in particular, always has a rousing effect on the men of their side. The army each god supports is encouraged by their god or gods present. They will find themselves able to fight longer and with greater strength. With both Athene for the Greeks and Apollo for the Trojans here, we can expect the battle to rage on back and forth more or less evenly. It's when one side has a god present and the other doesn't that things go bad for the other side. And how about that closing statement? Many Trojans that day and many Achaeans were laid side by side upon their faces in the dust. Grim. And we're just getting started. The battle will continue into Book 5 with a whole lot of really intense fighting, including the first Aristeion of the Iliad. And oh wow, this is going to be a good one. Aristeia are special episodes within the Iliad where a single fighter is empowered by a god to go on a rampage. And throughout the rest of the Iliad, there will be several Aristeia. And the one of Book 5 is absolutely incredible. What a great way to start. The gods themselves will be howling with pain by the end of Book 5. We are getting into the true action of the Iliad here. With the truce violated, Greeks and Trojans can no longer trust one another at all. Now that all hope of reconciliation is over, all that's left for the Greeks and the Trojans is to battle. Until next time, this has been Daniel with Your Mythology Book Club. Thanks for listening.